In the early days of their marriage, King Charles III and Princess Diana seemed to have it all: charm, grace, and the perfect royal image. To the world, their relationship looked like a fairy tale, one that many admired and wished to emulate. Princess Diana, with her beauty and poise, quickly became a favorite of the public. She was the perfect match for Charles, the heir to the throne, who was equally admired for his calm demeanor and the sense of responsibility he carried as the future king. Together, they made a striking couple, always appearing in public with smiles, elegance, and dignity. The world saw their every move, from their grand weddings to the way they raised their children, Prince William and Prince Harry. The couple often attended royal events, met with world leaders, and supported various charities, presenting themselves as the epitome of royal perfection. They made public appearances at galas, ceremonies, and charity functions, showing the world a flawless version of royalty. But behind the curtains of this perfect public image, things were not as they seemed. The pressure of constantly being in the spotlight was suffocating. Every outfit Diana wore, every gesture she made, every word she spoke was scrutinized by the media. The same was true for Charles. They were both expected to maintain an image of unwavering perfection, keeping their personal struggles hidden from the public eye. The expectations of the royal family were immense, and there was no room for weakness or vulnerability. Princess Diana, though loved by the public for her warmth and kindness, struggled with the loneliness that came with her royal life. Being in the royal family meant living under constant observation, and there were strict rules about how they were supposed to behave. She had little room to express herself freely. The weight of royal expectations pressed heavily on her, and she began to feel isolated, even in the midst of a busy life surrounded by people. For Charles, the pressure was equally intense. As the future king, he had been raised to uphold the traditions of the monarchy. He was always aware of his duty and responsibilities. He had been groomed for a life of service to the country, but it meant that he had to follow a path that was already laid out for him. There was little room for him to show his true emotions or personal desires. His role as the heir to the throne was always at the forefront, and everything else had to come second. Diana, on the other hand, found herself caught between her own identity and the image that the royal family wanted her to project. She had always been a person who deeply cared about others, and she threw herself into charity work. Yet despite her charitable efforts, she felt misunderstood. Her real emotions were often buried under layers of royal protocol. She had married into a family that required her to put on a brave face no matter what was happening in her personal life. At times, Charles, too, felt the weight of living a life dictated by tradition and duty. Although he loved Diana, he struggled to balance his personal feelings with his responsibilities as the future king. The royal family had its own set of rules, and those rules were not flexible. Both Charles and Diana had to play their roles perfectly. They were expected to represent the monarchy and uphold its values, and to do so with grace. Behind the scenes, however, there were cracks forming in their marriage, ones that only the two of them truly understood. Despite the pressure, Charles and Diana did find moments of connection in the midst of their royal duties. They would sometimes share private moments when they were not in the spotlight, moments where they could break away from the expectations of the world, but these moments were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming public attention they received. The rest of the world never saw these tender exchanges. Instead, the media painted a picture of a perfect couple, one that was not burdened by the same challenges and struggles that most ordinary people faced. The reality, however, was different. Princess Diana, known for her incredible empathy and love for others, felt deeply isolated. She often spoke about feeling trapped in the rigid structure of royal life. Her every move was watched by the public, and every word she said was analyzed by the media. There were even rumors that her relationship with Charles was not as perfect as it appeared. Despite their public smiles and coordinated appearances, Diana struggled with loneliness and a sense of emotional distance from her husband. Charles, on his part, felt a sense of responsibility that often left him feeling distant from Diana. He had been trained for a life of duty, and it was his duty to the monarchy that often came before his personal happiness. While he loved Diana, he also knew that his position in the royal family required him to maintain a certain distance from her emotionally, especially in public. It was not easy for him to express his feelings, as he was always expected to remain calm, collected, and in control. As the years passed, the cracks in their marriage grew larger. What began as a promising and seemingly perfect union slowly began to reveal its flaws. The royal family's strict code of conduct left little room for personal emotions, and this only made the couple feel more isolated. Diana, in particular, struggled with the expectation that she would always be poised and perfect in front of the cameras, even when she was falling apart on the inside. Charles, though equally affected by the pressures of his role, was more accustomed to the expectations of the monarchy. He had been trained for this life from a young age, and knew how to keep his emotions hidden from the public. But even he found himself longing for a deeper connection with Diana, one that went beyond the royal duties they both had to fulfill. Yet the more they tried to break free from the roles they were assigned, the harder it became. The royal facade they had built so carefully began to crack, and the world started to see glimpses of the personal struggles they faced behind closed doors. For the first time, the public began to question the image of the perfect royal couple that had been carefully constructed for years. The contrast between their public lives and private struggles became evident, and the world began to wonder what was really going on behind the scenes. In the end, the story of Charles and Diana was one of immense pressure, duty, and a constant struggle to balance personal happiness with the expectations of the royal family. The public saw only the outward appearances, the smiles, the perfect photo opportunities, and the charitable work. But behind it all was a much deeper, more complex reality. Charles and Diana were not just royal figures. They were human beings, dealing with their own emotions, frustrations, and desires. The royal family had always emphasized duty above all else, but for Charles and Diana, this duty came at a great personal cost. As they navigated the complexities of their marriage, their lives became a constant balancing act between personal desires and public expectations. What the world didn't know was that, behind the perfect smiles, both Charles and Diana longed for something more, something real, something that would allow them to be their true selves, free from the constraints of the royal title. And so, their journey continued with the world watching, yet never fully understanding the weight they carried. Their personal struggles remained largely hidden, but for those closest to them it was clear that beneath the royal facade, there was much more than met the eye. As time went on, the picture-perfect image of Prince Charles and Princess Diana began to slowly unravel. Beneath the royal facade that had been so carefully constructed for the public eye, there was a growing tension that both of them struggled to hide. The pressure of being constantly under the spotlight began to take its toll, and each day felt like another battle between their personal feelings and their public roles. For Diana, the weight of royal expectations was suffocating. When she first entered the royal family, she was young, full of energy, and eager to please everyone. She wanted to make a difference, and she hoped her new life as a princess would give her the chance to do so. But it didn't take long for her to realize that royal life was nothing like she had imagined. Despite her outward charm and the warmth she showed to the public, Diana was struggling on the inside. The pressure to maintain a perfect image was overwhelming. Every appearance had to be flawless. Every outfit, every gesture, every word she said was analyzed and critiqued. The public expected her to be a flawless princess, but behind closed doors, she was fighting to hold herself together. She often found herself in a constant battle between wanting to be true to herself and knowing that she had to meet the expectations of the royal family. This emotional struggle was exhausting, and over time, it began to affect her mental and emotional health. Charles, too, was feeling the strain of the royal duties that defined his life. As the heir to the throne, he had been groomed from a young age to be the future king, and with that came a lifetime of responsibility. His role required him to remain composed at all times, to carry out his duties without showing any weakness. Unlike Diana, Charles was more accustomed to the expectations placed on him. He had been raised to be the future king, and he understood the importance of maintaining a strong, regal image. But that didn't mean he was immune to the emotional toll. Inside, Charles was struggling with the weight of his position. While he had a deep love for Diana, their marriage felt strained because of the pressure they both faced. His duties to the royal family and the people often came before his personal feelings, leaving him with little room to express his true emotions. He had been taught to keep his feelings under control, to always put duty before personal desires. And so, Despite the growing tension between him and Diana, Charles remained outwardly calm, hiding the turmoil he felt inside. In the privacy of their home, away from the prying eyes of the public and the press, the couple began to drift further apart. Diana, who had always been a person of deep emotion, longed for a connection with Charles that went beyond their royal roles. She needed emotional support, someone who would listen to her fears and frustrations. But Charles, caught in his own responsibilities and obligations, was often distant. He had his own struggles to deal with, and despite his love for Diana, he found it difficult to be there for her in the way she needed. As the years went on, their marriage began to feel more like a partnership of convenience than a true, loving relationship. Diana's emotional needs were not being met, and she started to feel more isolated than ever. She had married a man who, despite his royal charm, was unable to provide her with the emotional connection she desperately sought. Charles, too, was struggling with his own feelings of isolation. Although he was surrounded by people, he often felt as though he was alone in the world. The royal family's expectations, combined with his own duties, made it difficult for him to form genuine, meaningful connections. As Diana felt more disconnected from Charles, she began to turn to other sources for support. She reached out to her friends, her family, and even the people she met through her charity work. The public often saw her as a graceful and perfect figure, but behind the scenes, she was searching for comfort and understanding wherever she could find it. She became more involved in her charitable work, pouring her energy into helping others in a way that gave her a sense of purpose. But even this, though deeply fulfilling, could not completely fill the emotional void she felt at home. Charles, too, found solace in his own way. As he struggled with his role as the future king, he found it difficult to express his emotions openly. Instead of turning to Diana for comfort, he retreated further into his royal duties, keeping his feelings to himself. This emotional distance between them grew over time, and it became clear that their marriage was no longer the partnership it once had been. Despite the growing strain between them, there were still moments of tenderness, though they became rarer with each passing year. Every now and then, Diana and Charles would share quiet moments where the walls they had built up between them seemed to come down. In these moments, they would talk about their shared responsibilities, the pressures they faced, and the loneliness they both felt in their roles. But these conversations were often fleeting, overshadowed by the royal duties that were always waiting for them. In public, they continued to appear as a united front. The royal family expected nothing less, and they were masters at maintaining appearances. But behind closed doors, their marriage was becoming more and more strained. Diana's sadness was hard to hide, even from those closest to her. She began to show signs of emotional distress, and the public started to notice that something was off. She became more open about her struggles, though still careful not to reveal too much. She spoke about her loneliness, her feelings of being trapped in a life that was not her own, and the emotional distance between her and Charles. Charles, too, began to show signs of stress. The pressure of his royal duties, combined with the growing distance in his marriage, weighed heavily on him. He started to question the role he had been born into, wondering if he would ever be able to live a life that was truly his own. He felt torn between his love for Diana and his commitment to the crown. The royal family, which had always been his guiding force, now felt like a source of pressure and frustration. At the heart of their struggles was the realization that they were both living lives that were not entirely their own. The royal family, with all its traditions and expectations, had shaped their identities from the very beginning. They had been taught how to behave, how to speak, and how to appear in public. But in the process, they had lost sight of who they were as individuals. Diana, a young woman with dreams of making a difference in the world, had become a symbol of royalty rather than a person in her own right. Charles, the future king, had been trained for duty, but had never been given the freedom to be himself. As they continued to navigate their troubled marriage, both Charles and Diana began to search for ways to reclaim their own identities. But the more they struggled to break free from the constraints of their roles, the harder it became. The royal family's expectations were deeply ingrained, and both of them found it difficult to escape the weight of tradition. In the end, This chapter of their story was one of emotional turmoil and isolation. Despite the love they once shared, the pressures of royal life began to push them further apart. Charles and Diana were two individuals caught in a system that did not allow them to be true to themselves. Their struggle for emotional connection was not just between them, it was a reflection of the larger struggle between their personal desires and the responsibilities they had inherited. As time moved on, the cracks in King Charles and Princess Diana's marriage became impossible to ignore. What had once appeared to be a picture-perfect royal relationship was now marred by growing emotional distance and unspoken frustrations. The constant pressure of their roles in the royal family, combined with their personal differences, began to take a toll on their marriage. For both of them, the hope of finding happiness within their union was slipping further away. Behind the scenes, away from the public eye, the emotional toll on both Charles and Diana was becoming more evident. Their private moments, once filled with shared hopes and dreams, now felt more like reminders of the growing gap between them. It wasn't that they didn't love each other. There was still affection, but it was overshadowed by years of emotional neglect, loneliness, and unfulfilled needs. For Diana, it had become clear that the emotional support she needed from Charles was simply not there. She longed for his attention, his understanding, and his presence, but Charles was often preoccupied with his royal duties and responsibilities. There were times when Diana felt as though she was invisible to him, trapped in a marriage that had become more of a partnership by obligation than a true emotional connection. She began to feel like she was living in a gilded cage, unable to be herself or express her emotions freely. The isolation Diana felt in her marriage only deepened as she continued to live under the ever-watchful eyes of the media. Everywhere she went, the press was there, capturing every moment of her life, whether she was smiling or looking lost in thought. The media's constant scrutiny made it difficult for her to find any peace. Even her charity work, which was something she had once turned to for comfort, no longer brought the same joy it once did. She poured herself into these causes, hoping that helping others would fill the emptiness she felt inside, but it wasn't enough. She needed to feel understood, seen, and loved. Meanwhile, Charles was facing his own internal struggles. As the heir to the throne, he had always felt the weight of his royal duties. The role he had been born into was one he could never escape. He had been raised with the understanding that the crown came first, before his personal happiness, before his marriage, and even before his family. Yet, as he grew older, he began to question whether this life of duty was truly what he wanted. The more he tried to fulfill his responsibilities as the future king, the more distant he became from Diana, and from his own emotions. The turning point in their relationship came during moments of rare honesty between them. In private conversations away from the prying eyes of the public, Diana and Charles began to open up in ways they hadn't before. These were not easy conversations. They were filled with pain and frustration. Diana expressed her deep loneliness, her feelings of being trapped, and the emotional gap that had developed between them. She spoke of her yearning for a connection with Charles that went beyond their public appearances and royal obligations. She wanted to feel that he truly understood her fears, her dreams, and her struggles. Charles, for his part, admitted that he too felt the weight of the royal family's expectations and that it often left him feeling isolated and misunderstood. He spoke of his internal conflict, his love for Diana, but also his devotion to the crown. He knew that as the future king, he was expected to put his personal desires aside and prioritize the monarchy above all else. This burden weighed heavily on him, and it had affected his relationship with Diana. He explained that he had always believed his royal duties were what would bring him fulfillment, but now he was beginning to doubt that this was enough to bring him happiness. In these conversations, both Diana and Charles broke down the walls they had carefully built over the years. For a brief moment, they were able to share their true feelings with one another. It was a raw and vulnerable exchange, but it also made them realize the depth of the emotional distance between them. Despite their shared moments of honesty, neither of them knew how to fix the growing divide. The weight of their roles in the royal family seemed to prevent them from fully connecting on an emotional level. While these heartfelt moments were rare, they were also telling. They showed that both Diana and Charles were longing for something more, something deeper, but they didn't know how to make it happen. Their royal duties always seemed to come first, leaving little room for personal growth or emotional fulfillment. Their lives had become a series of public appearances and royal events, and the strain of living in the public eye only made their personal struggles worse. For Diana, the realization that her emotional needs were not being met by her marriage was painful. She had once believed that love would conquer all, but now, she felt like she was alone in her struggle. She often turned to her friends and family for comfort, seeking solace in the relationships where she felt understood. But even this couldn't fill the emptiness that had settled in her heart. She had married a man who, despite his best intentions, could not provide her with the emotional support she craved. As the pressure continued to build, Diana found herself becoming more open about her struggles. She began speaking out about her feelings. Though not always in ways the royal family would have approved of, she started to share more of her personal experiences, hoping that by being more transparent, she could find a way to connect with others who understood what she was going through. The public, who had once seen her as the perfect princess, now saw a more vulnerable side of her, one that resonated with many who had also faced their own personal battles. Charles, on the other hand, remained more reserved. He continued to carry the burden of his royal duties, trying to maintain the image of a composed, responsible heir to the throne. But his internal struggles were growing harder to ignore. He began to question his future and whether the life he had been groomed for was truly the one he wanted. His love for Diana was real, but he had never been able to reconcile it with his duty to the crown. The more he tried to live up to the expectations of the royal family, the more distant he became from the woman he had once loved deeply. The public began to sense the tension between them, and the media, ever hungry for stories, began to speculate more openly about the state of their marriage. The tabloids in particular had a field day with rumors and stories about their relationship. Diana's growing openness only fueled the media's interest, and they followed her every move with relentless scrutiny. For Charles, this constant attention was another source of stress. He wanted to protect his family and his personal life, but the public's insatiable curiosity made it nearly impossible. This period marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The turning point had arrived. Both Diana and Charles had acknowledged the emotional distance that had grown between them, but they were unsure how to move forward. Their heartfelt moments of honesty had shown them the depth of their feelings, but also the limitations of their marriage. They both wanted more than what they had, but neither knew how to bridge the gap between duty and personal happiness. As they faced the reality of their situation, both Charles and Diana knew that something had to change. Their marriage, built on love and hope, had begun to crack under the weight of royal expectations and personal disappointments. The question now was whether they could find a way to repair the damage or if their differences would prove too great to overcome. The royal couple's story had reached a turning point, and the next chapter would bring with it even more challenges. Challenges that would ultimately change their lives forever. As the years passed, Princess Diana's role in the royal family evolved. She had been known for her charm, grace, and charity work, but as time went on, she began to realize that simply being the perfect princess wasn't enough to bring her fulfillment. More and more, Diana felt the weight of the expectations placed on her, not just by the royal family but by the public. The image of the flawless royal was something that she could never fully live up to, and it began to take a toll on her. At a certain point, Diana started to question the life she had been living. She had spent much of her early years as a royal focused on her duties and public appearances, trying her best to be the ideal wife, mother, and ambassador for various charities. But she was slowly realizing that while the public adored her for her kindness and charitable efforts, she wasn't truly happy. She wasn't allowed to express herself fully, nor was she able to connect with people in the way she desired. Despite the overwhelming pressure to maintain a perfect image, Diana began to find ways to break free from the rigid rules and constraints of royal life. She had been taught from a young age that the royal family had to remain composed at all times, that their private lives should be kept private, and that any personal struggles should never be shared with the world. But Diana began to feel that the only way she could truly be herself was to show the public the real, unpolished version of herself. It wasn't easy, but with each step, she found the courage to push back against the royal traditions that had once defined her life. One of the most significant moments of this personal shift came during a charity event in the early 1990s. Diana, known for her work with AIDS patients and the homeless, was attending an event where she was meant to meet people from all walks of life. Instead of adhering strictly to royal protocol, Diana broke from tradition by shaking hands with patients who were suffering from HIV/AIDS, a gesture that, at the time, was considered controversial. In the early years of the AIDS epidemic, there was a great deal of fear and misunderstanding surrounding the disease, and people with AIDS were often stigmatized and shunned. But Diana, in her characteristic compassion, chose to stand beside those who were often ignored and mistreated. In doing so, she sent a powerful message to the world that transcended the usual royal formalities. By publicly reaching out to people with AIDS, she not only showed her genuine concern for their well-being, but also helped to break down the stigma surrounding the disease. Her actions were an act of defiance against the royal expectations that had so often restricted her, and in that moment, she found a sense of freedom. Diana was no longer just a symbol of royal perfection. She had become a human being who cared deeply about those who needed help the most. This act of breaking from tradition was not the only time Diana would step outside the boundaries of royal life. Throughout the next several years, she became more and more outspoken about her personal struggles. She began to speak openly about her battle with depression, her struggles with her marriage, and the loneliness she often felt in the royal spotlight. While the royal family had always emphasized maintaining a strong, stoic exterior, Diana decided that it was time to be honest, even if it meant going against royal expectations. In 1995, during an interview with BBC's Martin Bashir, Diana revealed some of the most intimate details of her life. She spoke candidly about her marriage to Charles, acknowledging the difficulties they had faced and the emotional turmoil she had endured. One of the most famous lines from the interview was when she said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." This statement, referring to Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, struck a chord with the public. For the first time, Diana was no longer hiding her pain behind a public mask. She was showing the world that despite being a princess, she was a real person with real struggles. The impact of the interview was profound. It was a moment of truth, not just for Diana but for the entire royal family. The public had long admired Diana for her beauty and elegance, but now they saw a different side of her, a vulnerable woman who had been broken by the weight of her royal life. Her willingness to speak out about her personal struggles made her more relatable to people, and her honesty resonated deeply with millions around the world. As Diana continued to break away from the constraints of royal life, she also began to redefine her role within the monarchy. She no longer felt the need to conform to the royal standards of behavior that had been imposed on her for so long. She focused on her charitable work with renewed passion, choosing causes that were important to her, such as homelessness, children's hospitals, and landmine clearance. Her involvement in these causes became a way for her to connect with people on a deeper level and to make a real difference in the world. In many ways, Diana's break from royal protocol helped to humanize the monarchy. Her openness about her struggles and her willingness to engage with the public on a more personal level made her a beloved figure, not just as a princess, but as a woman who cared about the world around her. Her actions also inspired others to be more open about their own struggles, showing that it was okay to not always be perfect. But Diana's growing independence also came with challenges. Her increasingly public persona, especially her candidness about her marriage and her personal life, created friction within the royal family. The monarchy had long upheld the belief that royal members should maintain a level of privacy, and Diana's willingness to share her story with the world was seen by some as a breach of royal protocol. There was tension within the family as Diana pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable behavior for a royal. Despite these challenges, Diana's authenticity continued to win her the affection of the public. The more she revealed about herself, the more people connected with her. She became a symbol of compassion and resilience, showing that it was possible to be both royal and real. Her willingness to speak out, to break away from the constraints of her role, and to embrace her own humanity made her a beloved figure, one who was admired not just for her title, but for her heart. Throughout this time, Charles was largely silent. The public rarely heard his side of the story, and the royal family as a whole remained tight-lipped about the breakdown of Diana's marriage. While Diana's openness was celebrated by many, it also caused a great deal of tension within the royal household. But Diana, in her heart, knew that she had to keep going, not just for herself but for those who needed her most. Her break from royal constraints wasn't about rejecting her royal duties. It was about finding a way to balance those duties with her own personal well-being. Diana was no longer just a figurehead. She was a woman with a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The emotional and public challenges she faced ultimately shaped her legacy, one that remains inspiring to this day. By breaking free from the restrictions of royal life, Diana showed the world that even within the confines of royalty, there is room for humanity. In the aftermath of their marriage, both Princess Diana and King Charles III were left to navigate their lives in the public eye, but now as individuals rather than as a couple. Their divorce, although anticipated by many, marked a major turning point in their personal journeys. The pain, the scrutiny, and the years of living under the pressure of royal expectations were now behind them, but the scars they had carried were not so easily erased. The world continued to watch as their lives unfolded in new and unexpected ways. For Diana, the period after her divorce was a time of intense transformation. She was no longer a princess in the traditional sense. Her title remained, but her identity was no longer tied to her role as Charles's wife. She was now a woman who could shape her own path, a mother, a humanitarian, and a symbol of personal strength. Her life became a journey of self-discovery, a process of reclaiming her own voice and identity. In the years following the divorce, Diana continued her work with charity, but with an even deeper sense of purpose. She had always been passionate about helping others, but now her charitable endeavors were her own, free from the constraints of royal protocol. She worked tirelessly with organizations that focused on issues that were close to her heart, including homelessness, children's hospitals, and landmine removal. Diana traveled to places where few would go, dangerous regions and areas in crisis. She reached out to people who were often overlooked, bringing attention to causes that desperately needed it. Diana's legacy as a compassionate humanitarian was solidified during these years. Her visits to war-torn countries and her work with AIDS patients, whom she had famously embraced publicly, made her a beloved figure around the world. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was someone who deeply cared about the world's most vulnerable. Through her actions, Diana showed the world that kindness and empathy were qualities far more valuable than royal titles. She had become an icon of compassion, admired not just for her beauty, but for her ability to connect with people on a personal level. At the same time, Diana struggled with the loneliness that came with being so publicly scrutinized. While she had more freedom than ever before, she often felt isolated. The world had watched her as she grew up, got married, had children, and then experienced the end of her marriage. Her personal life, with all its highs and lows, was laid bare for the public to see. Even though she had taken steps to break free from the royal constraints that once defined her, there were still moments when she longed for peace and privacy. Yet, Diana continued to evolve and find joy in new parts of her life. She spent time with her children, Prince William and Prince Harry, who were growing up in a world that was completely different from the one she had known as a royal. She reveled in the simple joys of being a mother, something that had always been deeply important to her. Diana's bond with her children became stronger after the divorce, and she made it her priority to ensure that they were protected from the pressures she had faced. Charles, too, was finding his own way in the world after the end of his marriage. While he had always known that one day he would become king, the reality of his future role began to feel more pressing. The divorce had reshaped public perceptions of him, and it was clear that his path to the throne would not be as straightforward as once imagined. He was no longer the young, dashing prince who had captivated the world with his marriage to Diana. He was now the divorced man and the future king, a position that carried a heavy burden. Despite the challenges, Charles continued to focus on his royal duties. He found solace in his work with various charitable organizations, particularly those that focused on environmental issues, architecture, and social justice. Through his charitable endeavors, Charles sought to make a lasting impact on the world, particularly in areas where he felt passionate about creating positive change. His public persona was evolving, and he was beginning to be recognized for his long-standing commitment to causes that had been dear to him long before his marriage to Diana had ended. But as the years went on, it became clear that Charles' relationship with Diana would always be part of his story. While they had both moved forward in their individual lives, the public had a deep interest in their past. and the media often focused on their shared history. Charles, like Diana, continued to live in the shadow of their marriage. And as the years passed, the legacy of their relationship became more complicated. The love story that had captivated the world had, over time, been replaced by a story of personal struggle, growth, and eventual separation. The end of their marriage did not mean the end of their connection, though. Diana and Charles, despite their differences, shared a bond that remained, particularly through their children. Their mutual love for Prince William and Prince Harry was one thing that always kept them tied together. Even though their marriage had dissolved, they both remained dedicated to being good parents. And despite the emotional complexities of their past, both Charles and Diana were determined to raise their sons with love and care, doing everything they could to ensure that they had the best possible upbringing. In 1997, just a few years after her divorce, Diana's life was tragically cut short in a car accident in Paris. The world was shocked by her sudden death, and millions mourned the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness, grace, and compassion. Diana had become a symbol of strength, not just for women but for people everywhere who felt misunderstood or marginalized. Her legacy lived on through her charity work, her children, and the countless lives she had impacted. Charles, in the years following her death, would often reflect on the complexities of his relationship with Diana. He had loved her, but they had been deeply affected by the pressures of royal life and personal differences. After her death, Charles found himself more determined than ever to fulfill his duties as future king. But he also took on a more reflective, compassionate approach to his royal role. He became more open about his own experiences, sharing his personal struggles with the public in ways that he had never done before. For Prince William and Prince Harry, their mother's death was a life-changing event. Both of them grew up under the shadow of their parents' troubled marriage, but they carried forward Diana's legacy in their own ways. They embraced her commitment to charity and followed in her footsteps, becoming involved in causes that mattered to them. Her legacy was not just defined by the public's adoration, but by the personal values she instilled in them. Over time, Diana's impact became more clear. She had not only reshaped the public's perception of what it meant to be a royal, but it also left a lasting mark on how people viewed compassion, charity, and authenticity. Her willingness to be vulnerable and speak out about her own struggles changed the conversation about mental health, loneliness, and personal well-being. Her legacy was one of humanity, showing that even the most public figures are, at their core, human. For Charles, the years after Diana's death were marked by a journey of his own. He had faced immense scrutiny during his marriage and even more after it ended. But over time, he came to understand that the monarchy, while a source of duty and responsibility, did not have to define him. As the years passed, Charles began to focus more on his role as a future king with a new perspective, one that would incorporate his passions for the environment, social justice, and personal growth. And ultimately, as the monarch, he would aim to lead with compassion, shaped by the lessons he had learned from his marriage and from Diana's remarkable legacy.